Hi there, everyone. So welcome to the final panel of our workshop on methodologies in the anthropology of ethics. This is a joint initiative between the Sussex Social Science and Ethics Research Group, the Social Anthropology Department, and the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. Special thanks go to my colleagues, James McMurray and Santiago Ripoll, who have organised the workshop with me. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to say that if anyone is interested in joining our ethics research network and receiving news of future events, please email us, or you can put your name and email in group chat. Today's panel will feature contributions from anthropologists interested in theories and methodologies of the cognitive sciences, their potential relevance for the ethnographic study of morality and ethics, and possible collaboration and exchange between disciplines. We're very pleased to have contributions from Richard Swader from the University of Chicago, Monica Heinz from Paris Nanterre, Radu Umbres from SNSPA University, and Julia Casaniti from Washington State. We are also joined by our colleague Demet Dinle of the University of Sussex as discussants. So just to go over the format of today's panel, we will start with presentations from each of our four speakers of approximately 20 minutes in length, and we will then take a 10-minute break. Demet will then have approximately 10 minutes to summarize each of the four contributions and ask some questions of the panel, and we will then take rounds of questions from the floor. So without taking up any more time, I would like to get started with our first speaker, Richard Swader. Richard Swader is a cultural anthropologist and the Harold Higgins Swift Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. He is author of Thinking Through Cultures, Expeditions in Cultural Psychology and Wider Men Barbecue, Recipes for Cultural Psychology, and editor of many books in the areas of cultural psychology, psychological anthropology, and comparative human development. He has made contributions to the study of moral psychology in culturally liberal and illiberal societies, and his current research examines the scope and limits of tolerance for cultural diversity in Western liberal democracies. So, Rick, if you're ready, could you take it away, please?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for zooming in. Over the past several decades, I have been studying the moral foundations of diverse cultural traditions, both liberal and illiberal. The anthropology of morality is, at least in part, the study of what members of different moral heritage traditions think and mean when they express their approval of a behavior and judge it to be right and good, or when they express their disapproval of a behavior and judge it to be wrong and bad, or even very bad, like wicked, sinful, or evil. There's more than a little irony in this type of anthropological calling. Many of the communities studied by cultural anthropologists are quite illiberal. Their members feel viscerally attached to their own particular historical ethical community, grounded in its own identity-defining metaphysical beliefs and legends or origin stories of one sort or another. These are communities where members draw strong in-group versus out-group distinctions, do not believe that there but for fortune goes you or goes I, do believe that gods, goddesses, and the spirits of the dead play a continuing part in human history, feel duty-bound to live up to their briefs for behavior distinctive of their social status within the community, which are often embedded in hierarchical interdependent relationships, and frequently discriminate in favor or against other individuals on the basis of sex, age, kinship, ethnicity, and religion. While many of the cultural anthropologists who study those illiberal traditions are themselves quite liberal and tend to equate the moral domain with values such as individual autonomy, non-discrimination, justice, equality, and freedom of choice. The cultural anthropologists whose own moral thinking is steeped in a liberal ethics of autonomy seeks to understand and fairly represent the way of life of a people whose moral thinking is rooted in an ethics of community and an ethics of divinity. It's quite a challenge. Let me begin by saying what I mean by a moral judgment as opposed to other types of judgments. Then I will try to address a second challenging and unavoidable question that arises when one tries to understand and represent the moral traditions of others. Are the different kinds of moral heritage traditions studied by anthropologists different but equal? Let's call this the pluralist interpretation of difference. Or are they different but unequal and hence scalable from worse to better or from inferior to superior? Let's call this the developmental interpretation of difference. By a moral judgment, I mean a judgment applied to an issue having existential significance that can be expressed in the following form. In situation S, person P ought to behave in such and such a way because it's the right thing to do. Here an account is being offered of local social norms. And it is the right thing to do because that behavior by that person in that situation promotes some absolute good. For example, loyalty or justice, and makes manifest or instantiates one of the rules of moral reason. For example, that one should protect the vulnerable who are in one's charge. Here an account is being offered of the way the social order is connected to, makes manifest, or is part of the moral order. I'll provide a concrete example in a moment. But first, let me unpack that definition of a moral judgment. I invite you to think of the anthropology of morality as the study of the fate of moral absolutes in history and culture. And I'd like to suggest that what I just referred to as moral absolutes come in three kinds. First, there exists a base set of genuinely self-evident, undeniably valid, and hence universally binding rules of moral reason. At least in their abstract form, they are not social or personal constructions. They are not the creations of either a second person or a first person point of view. Just as the mathematical intuition that two parallel lines cannot enclose a square, immediately and without the need for deliberation or thoughtful reflection, commands our respect as obviously true, so too the rules of moral reason. Their validity is immediately obvious and goes without saying. These are the kinds of rules of reason which 19th century and early 20th century philosophers called moral intuitions. They are objective, not subjective. That means they possess more than just that illusory air of self-evidence that is the commonplace atmosphere surrounding socially conditioned routines or habits. These moral absolutes are not illusory. They are not like the many second-person declarations we assume to be self-evidently true simply because they're our declarations, or because they are familiar or popular ways of doing things in our social world. For example, for members of this or that social world, that it is self-evident that married couples ought to sleep in the same bed at night, or that boys ought to get circumcised when they reach adolescence. Here are some examples of the absolute or objective rules of moral reason I have in mind. That one ought to give every person their due, treat like cases alike and different cases differently, impartially apply rules of general applicability, protect those who are vulnerable and in one's charge, respond to the urgent needs of others if the sacrifice or cost to oneself is slight. Secondly, there is a base set of universal existential issues, or what might be called basic social existence themes, sets. These themes are existential questions of great significance that must be answered in one way or another if one is to have and sustain a way of life or create any cultural tradition at all. Being existential questions, they cannot be escaped. Because they are unavoidable questions, they are universal. Here are some examples of universal existential issues. The question of personal boundaries, what is me and what's not me? The question of sex identity, what is male and what is female? The question of hierarchy, how should burdens and benefits of life be distributed and why? The question of in-group versus out-group differentiation, who is of my kind and who's not of my kind, who can I trust and who can I not trust? Thirdly, there is the domain of objective values or goods. These plural goods, these desire-worthy, inherently valuable ends in themselves, can be classified based on their differential saliency across moral heritage communities or across institutions and status relationships within a community. For example, the military versus the academy, or marketplace relationships versus kinship relationships. And they can be correlated with other features of self-culture, culture and society in these communities. Schemes have been induced for comparative research on moral judgments. For example, the so-called big three of morality, the ethics of autonomy, the ethics of community, the ethics of divinity, or so-called moral foundations theory. Classified within such schemes are values or goods such as safety or freedom from harm, justice, and equality, theorized as autonomy supporting values in the service of a preference seeking self, duty, hierarchy, respect, interdependency, sacrifice, and loyalty, theorized as community supporting values in the service of a social status maintaining self, and sacred order, purity, sanctity, cleanliness, theorized as divinity supporting values in the service of a self that feels connected to some higher transcendental realm. Nevertheless, all of those moral absolutes or universals, the rules of moral reason, for example, you ought to treat like cases alike in different cases differently, the significant existential issues, for example, how should burdens and benefits be distributed, what is male and what is female, and the objective values or goods, for example, loyalty, are given shape and substance, particularized and made concrete locally, not universally. Thus, the fate of moral absolutes in history is that they are implemented selectively and made manifest and instantiated in distinctly local, context-sensitive ways, resulting in different moral mentalities and various moral traditions. And that's where the problem of understanding and interpreting any particular moral heritage tradition comes face to face with the classic and longstanding anthropological problem of how to interpret cultural differences, and with the choice between two major alternative ways of doing so, pluralistic and developmental. That contrast I just drew between pluralistic and developmental interpretations of differences in the moral mentalities and ethical ways of life of different groups has a long history. Looking back 200 years, the moral philosopher Isaiah Berlin found the contrast in Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment debates in France and Germany in the late 18th century. He notes that for many progressive European Enlightenment authors, quote, there is only one universal civilization, of which now one nation, now another represents the richest flowering, end quote. According to that developmental interpretation of cultural differences, there is one ideal endpoint, definitive of progressive moral development, and it can and should be used to rank order the degree of development or backwardness of different moral mentalities and ways of life. Berlin went on to describe a contrastive pluralistic interpretation of cultural differences. He associated interpretive pluralism with the 18th century German counter-Enlightenment philosopher Johann Herder. Herder interpreted cultural differences this way, quoting Berlin, there is a plurality of incommensurable cultures. To belong to a given community, to be connected with its members by indissoluble and impalpable ties of a common language, historical memory, habit, tradition, and feeling, is a basic human need no less natural than that for food or drink or security or procreation. One nation can understand and sympathize with the institutions of another only because it knows how much its own means to itself, end quote. Fast forward from the late 18th century to the time I entered graduate school in the Department of Social Relations at Harvard University in 1966. Both modes of interpretation, the developmental and the pluralistic, were very much in play in the social sciences, as they continue to be today. Notably, by 1966, the developmental ranking of moral heritage traditions and ways of life from inferior to superior had gone out of fashion in American cultural anthropology. Over the course of the 20th century, it had become more or less unacceptably invidious for anthropologists to use developmental expressions such as primitive, savage, barbaric, heathen, oppressive, dark age, feudal, pre-modern, superstitious, religious, pre-logical, backward, or even just underdeveloped or maladaptive as ways of understanding and classifying others. For the most part, anthropologists had become pluralists and were quite willing to endure the accusation that they had gone soft on superstition or become apologists for pre-modern customs. At the same time, the developmental interpretation of differences in moral heritage tradition was alive and well. Indeed, it was a default position in developmental economics and mainstream developmental psychology. In developmental psychology, the writings of Jean Piaget on general stages in the development of modes of thought Lawrence Kohlberg on the levels and stages of moral judgment, which he applied to individuals and groups, and to some extent, Leonard Hobhouse's book, Morals and Evolution, were quite influential. Their theories were among the most well thought out 20th century attempts at a developmental interpretation of differences in moral mentalities. All three authors, Piaget, Kohlberg, and Hobhouse, were liberal, progressive descendants of the European Enlightenment who believed that the mental life of members of different heritage communities could be ranked on a universal developmental scale. Developmental interpretations of the sort they favored get made all the time, both within and across societies. Both fast, visceral, and slower reflective judgments get made about such things as whether monogamy is superior to polygamy, democratic governance superior to kingship or theocracy, or whether animism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and contemporary secular atheism can be lined up on some temporal developmental scale, reflecting the supersession of superior forms of understanding and revealing historical progress in human moral mentalities and ways of life. All three theorists were liberal Enlightenment thinkers who viewed tribalism or in-group favoritism and deference to hierarchy, so-called heteronomy, as lower forms of moral understanding. In-group favoritism they judged to be incompatible with the principle of justice as equality. Hierarchy they judged to be incompatible with respect for the autonomy of all individuals. All three argued that the social and moral consciousness of human beings had not only progressively developed over the course of cultural history, but should be encouraged to continue to evolve in what they viewed as the progressive liberal direction, liberating the individual from the constraints of inherited tradition and the burdens of ancestry. All three argued that in the earlier or less advanced stages, there was blind or unreflective adherence to the collective acceptances of one's tribe and subordination of one's capacity for rational self-determination to the will of dead ancestors and the dictates of authority figures. In the higher or more advanced stages, moral thinking aimed to give every autonomous person their rightful due with reference to impartial and objective standards of freedom, justice, and equality. In other words, the shift from collectivism to liberal individualism was seen as moral progress. Let me conclude with a concrete example from a moral judgment and reasoning interview typifying the moral thinking of both female and male Brahmin residents in a Hindu heritage community in a temple town in India. The concrete local behavior in question is a widow in your community eats fish 2 or 3 times a week. Locally, within this particular heritage community, the widow's dietary behavior, eating fish 2 or 3 times a week, is viewed as a very serious moral transgression. The interview is based on a collaborative research project conducted nearly 40 years ago with Joan Miller and Mohan Mahapatra. Which mode of interpretation, pluralistic or developmental, would you apply to the moral mentality of a Hindu subject who judges the widow's behavior to be wrong and sinful and reasons about her behavior this way? The interview unfolds as follows. Question: is the widow's behavior wrong? Answer: yes, widows should not eat fish, meat, onions, or garlic, or any hot foods. They must restrict their diet to cool foods, rice, dal, ghee, vegetables. Question: how serious is the violation? It's a very serious violation. She will suffer greatly if she eats fish. Is it a sin? Yes, it's a great sin. What if no one knew this had been done? It was done in secret or privately. Would it be wrong then? What difference does it make if it's done while alone? It's wrong. A widow's time should be spent seeking salvation, seeking to be reunited with the soul of her husband. Hot food will distract her. They will stimulate her sexual appetite. She will lose her sanctity and behave like a prostitute. Would it be best if everyone in the world followed the rule that widows should not eat fish? Answer: that would be best. A widow's devotion is to her deceased husband, who should be treated like a god. She will offend his spirit if she eats fish. Question: in the United States, widows eat fish all the time. Would United States be Would the United States be a better place if widows stopped eating fish? Answer, definitely it would be a better place. Perhaps American widows would stop having sex and marrying other men. Question, what if most people in India wanted to change the rule so that it would be all right for widows to eat fish? Would it be okay to change the rule? No, it's wrong for a widow to eat fish. Hindu dharma, truth, forbids it. Do you think a widow who eats fish should be stopped or punished in some way? Answer, she should be stopped, but the sin will live with her and she will suffer for it. Now imagine how that interview would go if conducted with residents in a European or North American community of the type some of us live in. I think I can tell you how it would go. The interview would be a testament to the ethics of autonomy and to the notion that everyone should be free to eat fish if they want to. There would be lots of talk about individual wants and preferences and the right of every individual to have the things she or he wants. The respondent would be highly likely to invoke a moral concept that never appeared in hundreds of interviews with Hindu temple town residents. Namely, in this instance, the idea of an inalienable, unalterable, unquestionable natural right to eat fish if you want to. Do you recall the interview probe concerning the alterability of the rule? What if we asked a Hyde Park, University of Chicago resident that question? What if the question being, what if most people in the United States wanted to change the rule so that widows would be forbidden from eating fish? Would it be okay to change the rule? Here's the way I imagine she or he might respond. No, you can't do that. It's not okay to impose an oppressive, sexist, patriarchal rule forbidding widows from eating fish. Secular, liberal dharma, truth, forbids it. All people in the world have a right to eat fish if they want to. So what was your own spontaneous snap mode of interpretation as you listened to the reasoning of the devout Hindu subject? Pluralistic or developmental? Did the reasoning flood you with unpleasant feelings or not? And how should we evaluate our own spontaneous or reflexive interpretation of other people's customs? On the one hand, we're faced with the reasoning of a Hindu subject whose arguments are rich in references to moral values or goods such as loyalty, devotion, sanctity, purity, which are moral absolutes drawn from an ethics of community and an ethics of divinity. On the other hand, we're faced with the reasoning of a secular liberal subject, it might well have been one of us, whose arguments are rich in references to freedom, wants, and the rights to have the things you want, which are moral absolutes drawn from a liberal, individual-focused ethics of autonomy. Is the reasoning of the two subjects different but equal or different but unequal, and why? Would you say, as I have said in some of my writings, that the illiberality of a cultural practice is not a measure of its immorality, that there can be moral universalism without moral uniformity, that instead of speaking of traditional values, we should speak of various traditions of value, and that diversity in local cultural manifestations of moral absolutes is their fate in history? Or alternatively, would you interpret the ethics of autonomy of the liberal subject as superior and more advanced than the ethics of community and the ethics of divinity of the devout Hindu subject? Are you a pluralist or are you a developmentalist with regard to different moral heritage traditions and in the way you construct your moral ethnographies? I mentioned earlier that by the time I entered graduate school in cultural anthropology, the developmental interpretation of different moral heritages and ways of life had gone out of fashion. Well, as it turns out, that displacement was only temporary. Even if unrecognized, ever since the late 1960s and early 1970s, developmental interpretations have been on a slow ascendancy in anthropology as a concomitant of the rise of global feminism and of various other universalizing human rights and humanitarian projects in which global means universal and universal implies uniformity. Nevertheless, speaking as a robust cultural pluralist and anthropologist of diverse moral heritages, liberal and illiberal, I do wonder if we want to fairly and accurately represent moral traditions different from our own, can we describe those differences without facing up to the normative challenge of evaluating them? And if our representations must take an evaluative turn, and we saturate them with normative judgments, approving or disapproving of the way of life of others that we are trying to interpret and render intelligible, how can we do it without being ethnocentric, without privileging our own parochial liberal ethics of autonomy in our representations of the alternative ethics and ways of life of others? When it comes to the anthropological study and interpretation of different moral heritage traditions, certain questions are unavoidable. Is liberal individualism better or worse than collectivism, or are they just different and equal forms of social organization? Is karmic, you reap what you sow, even across lifetimes, thinking superior or inferior to there but for fortune and genetic accident goes you or goes I thinking? Or are they just different equal modes of thought? Is the interdependent, hierarchically embedded status conscious self of the ethics of community more or less developed than the independent comparative shopping self of the ethics of autonomy? Or are they just different but equal ways of being? Is the liberal subject simply a local historical rarity in a plural universe of moral mentalities? Or is she or he the supposed next developmental stage in the progressive evolution of moral consciousness? I don't think those questions can be finessed, and I hope they won't be ducked as work goes forward during the current revival of interest in the anthropology of morality. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Rick. That was a very interesting talk. I'm sure will provoke discussion later on and also in the plenary as well. So without any further ado, I'd like to get on with our next speaker, who is Monica Heinz. So Monica, can I just check you're ready to speak? You have your thing set up? Hi, Monica, you ready to go? Yeah, I'll just introduce Monica. So Monica Heinz is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Paris-Nanterre and co-director of the Ethnology Laboratory, Sociology and Ethnology Laboratory at the same university. She has done field research in Eastern Europe and France and published books and articles on work, citizenship and transitional environments more generally. In her writings on ethics, she focuses mainly on the methodology of research. She is author of The Anthropology of Morality, a dynamic and interactionist approach, published with Routledge, and the edited volume Morality and Cognition with Isabelle Rioval, and also the edited volume The Anthropology of Moralities, published with Bergen Books. So if you're ready, Monica, please take it away.
Yes, thank you very much. There is just a problem with my micro. One of the main objections of anthropologists when confronted with data from the cognitive sciences of morality comes from the need to endorse their working hypothesis of the nature or origin of morality. Evolutionary theory has received no favorable reception in anthropology since social evolutionism was expelled from its bosom at the beginning of the 20th century. However, there has recently been a more open reception of naturist approaches, and cognitive anthropologists regularly call for them to be embraced. What really prevents anthropologists of morality from entering into dialogue with cognitive scientists of morality does not therefore come from the a priori rejection of evolutionary hypotheses, but from the specific reductionist hypotheses with which they work today when it comes to morality. This hypothesis is that morality is fundamentally an evolved solution to problems of social cooperation. I position myself against this reductionist view of morality as cooperation, and I would rather reformulate the hypothesis of the origins of morality as being prompted by the need for cooperation and by the need for transcendence. As the arguments that lead me to this hypothesis are too complex to be systematically presented here and also at this stage of my research, essentially working from John Haidt's social intuitionist model and Joshua Green's dual process model, here I shall merely present some preliminary reflections in support of this hypothesis, compatible with the recent work of Michael Tomasello, in which he considers morality as a result of a two-level process, only the first level of which is the need for cooperation in order to survive. This paper uses as a case study the role played by socialist utopia during the time of state socialism and contrast it with the role of the Western liberal model during the post-socialist period, post-1989. From the comparison between these two sets of moral imaginaries of the management of the common good, it goes on to argue that the need for transcendence is in ordinary lives is one of the reasons moral values exist. Moral values might be the result of a search for a more virtuous social life, but very often people need to get their will and their imagination of what a virtuous life is from external, transcendental, beyond ordinary creations, dreams, utopias, unattainable ideals. These ideals can be conveyed by religions, ideology, or by art. The transcendence I referred to has the means to materialize and to allow for ethnographic data gathering, analysis, and evaluation, which can be seen as scientific, as is the case when we study cooperation. The moral imagination would thus be explored in its embodied appearances, ranging from stories to artistic enactments. So how about socialist utopia? Is this the case study in moral imagination that I chose? A utopian project, a perfect social model without existence, cannot be better fulfilled than in its coming into being. The desire to reform the society that stems from dissatisfaction with the state of things that needs improvement is naturally driven towards a perfect imaginary model of society. A large-scale experiment of the refoundation of a society based on a utopian model was state socialism. But the history of the creation of state socialism is a story of a gradual renouncement of the perfection of the original utopian project in favor of the sustainability of the social experience underway up to the totalitarian drifts that resulted. However, during the entire state socialist period and parallel to these drifts, purges, liquidations, political and economic restrictions, the communist utopia remained a mobilizing reference for the population. Utopia comes from utopos, what has no place in Greek, and is a concept forged by Thomas More's book Utopia that appeared in 1516. More's book, which contains both a straightforward criticism of the government of his time and a highly appreciative description of the government of utopia, created a new literary genre that was to inspire many other literary works over the 5 centuries that followed. From literary reference, utopia gradually became synonymous with a civic and political ideal, but also later on with impossibility or even naivety. Utopias belong to the imaginary. They describe parallel worlds that do not intersect with the real one, no more than stories, myths, or religions do. We could have classified them as purely fictional and literary if this particular genre was not written by philosophers, economists, jurists, politicians, and entrepreneurs, including Thomas More, Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and Robert Owen, and if it was not aimed more at questioning the existing social order and presenting the basis for a new one, rather than at satisfying the pleasure of the imagination. Also, this line of thinking, privileging reason, had the opportunity to translate itself into action on a limited scale in the building of Charles Fourier's phalansteries and in France and in England around Robert Owen's cooperatives. So it is not to literature or philosophy that I refer in this case study, but to those utopias that from literary beginnings became political projects and guided the foundation of new worlds, socialist utopias. More precisely, the question that interests me here is that of the need for utopia in a project of refoundation of a society, which corresponds to the social and political context in which I conducted my fieldwork in Romania and Moldova. This question has a different ring today after exposure to 5 centuries of utopian thinking. Can a society involved in its own refunding evolve on the basis that they hope simply to do better than their predecessors, or do they need a perfect, imaginary, or real model, a transcendent reference? Socialist societies, the heirs of socialist utopias, and their successors, post-socialist societies, the heirs of state socialist projects considered dystopian, following their 1989 rejection, are case studies that allow us to put some flesh onto these philosophical interrogations. Thomas More's Utopia describes the features of the ideal society in terms that were later used to describe communism. equality, the common management of goods, the absence of property, money, and social classes, and even the lack of differentiation through clauses, for instance. Above all, Thomas More outlines a new kind of person under transformation from gross barbarian being and aiming to reach a yet unmet level of civilization, thus announcing the new man of the Marxist-Leninist doctrine. In the 19th century, Charles Fourier phalansteries or Robert Owen's cooperatives come into being in France and respectively England, following the same pattern. Karl Marx identifies these projects and polemically labels them utopian socialism with reference to More's imaginary non-existent community, so as to discredit them. As a solution to the problem of the inequality and poverty of the new working class, Karl Marx proposes a form of scientific socialism which will be rationally planned and organized. Moreover, it is not possible for the ideal classless society to come into being in a peaceful way. This is, in fact, the main point of rupture with Fourier and Owen's projects of universal harmony. For Marx and Engels, scientific socialism, characterized by the dictatorship of the proletariat, obtained through the reversal of the contemporary power balance, is a necessary step on the way to communism, the egalitarian ideal classless society in which men will no longer be alienated from the world. Scientific socialism promises to be realistic, to be material. It also emphasizes as central the building of class consciousness. Years later, however, when Lenin implements socialism in Russia, he realizes that Marx's project works only on paper. Lenin publishes What is to be Done in 1902, a political pamphlet in which he asserts that the class struggle should be conducted by a centralized party of professional revolutionaries, as it will not come spontaneously from the workers. After the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, he adds further constraining organizational features in order to manage a disorganized country. Democratic centralism, a planned society, means of control and coercion via the secret police. All these means are complementary to the necessary construction of the new man, able to work and live in a communist society. Stalin takes over from Lenin at the head of the USSR and introduces the doctrine of socialism in one country, a renouncement of the ideal version of a universal communism. He also definitely gives up transforming some categories of people into new men and decides to eliminate the non-reformable. This is the beginning of a series of purges of political opponents, the economical advantage, and followers of religion. By the 1930s, the totalitarian aspects of state socialism in its Stalinist form are blatantly evident, even to the more sympathetic foreign supporters. Personality cult, purges, and economic restrictions. Soviet socialism survives and is reinforced by the Second World War. The project diffuses across Eastern Europe and influences countries all over the globe. But the actually existing socialism, a term coined by German philosopher Rudolf Bauer to describe state socialism as it really was in the USSR and the Eastern European countries, departs more and more from the initial philosophical projects. Fear, scarcity, the leveling of people, ideas, and aspirations, and the lack of freedom come to characterize state socialism all over the Soviet bloc, albeit being presented in the 1980s as a result of arbitrary historical incidents. This is why Gorbachev's perestroika is welcomed in the USSR and Eastern Europe and is seen as a solution to an unfortunate deviance from the initial Marxist ideas. For a long time, the word socialism maintains a positive aura, even if it does not produce the expected results. In Eastern Europe, criticism is directed towards the dictatorship of a particular party leader and not the socialist project per se. The only sign of dystopia was a strange recurrence of these symptoms all over the Soviet bloc. Now, if we look at the post-communist pragmatics, in order to get the limits of the moral imagination of the better, the year 1989 marked the end of a dystopia. As a result, the foundations on which the new society by decree, that was the post-socialist society, emerged, were purposefully devoid of utopian characteristics. I will consider here what remained of the utopian projects in Romania in the post-1989 revolutionary years, before I question the difficulty of building a new society in the absence of a utopian imaginary. My analysis is based on ethnographic material collected in the 90s in Bucharest, Romania. In 1989, The disenchantment with socialism was due to the divorce between the socialist utopia and the actually existing socialism. During the 1989 Romanian Revolution, massive demonstrations and slogans were asking for communism, but with a human face, rather than for the end of the communist regime. It was only the recurring rejections of the regime all over Eastern Europe and the Western Cold War formulation of communism as the enemy that gradually crystallized the fault around the communist regime as a political project and led ultimately to rejection of communism itself. The sudden diffusion among Romanian intellectuals of films and books such as The Dictator with Charlie Chaplin, 1984 and Brave New World had a powerful role in the rather swift change of perspective. 1 month after the revolution, following 2 massive demonstrations and numerous late-night debates led by influential revolutionary intellectuals, the idea that communism was wrong and should be rejected as a regime started to spread among intellectuals, but the rest of the population did not follow. This was illustrated by the massive democratic vote for the ex-communist leaders gathered around Ion Iliescu in 1990. When looking back on the socialist period during the post-socialist years, Romanian intellectuals focused on the denunciation of the totalitarian aspects of the communist regime, the communist prisons and purges, the role of the secret police, and the lack of freedom of circulation and expression of ideas. The opening of the Securitate archives, the Romanian secret police archives, and the denunciation of those collaborators that were still in power during the post-socialist period was a major issue. Clearly, because the battle against communism could not be considered to have been won as long as ex-members of the communist nomenclatura were still in power. When looking at popular opinion regarding communism, the economic problems of the first 10 years of post-communism preserves the so-called nostalgia for communism praised for its equality and its job and life security, which was reflected in the vote for the same leader, Ion Iliescu Bossi in 1992 and in 2000. This divided society managed to advance in one single direction, that of the democratic free market model. Because the refusal of forced experimentation was general and the pressure from international organizations high, Romanian society chose to import the model that had proven efficient in generating wealth in the West. What is interesting to note here is that at the beginning of the 1990s, the Western model was not looked open as a pragmatic choice, but some utopian elements were sought within it. The Western world was idealized both by those who permanently migrated, despite the difficulties they encountered, and by those who remained at home. For instance, a story I have often heard is that of the amazing cleanliness of Germany. One Romanian on a visit to Germany lights up a cigarette and throws it onto the street, and the German reprimands him and makes him throw the butt in the bin. This, of course, plainly corresponds to the civic education inculcated by the communist regime, in which people are supposed to supervise their fellow citizens' behavior and educate them, and to both accept criticism and criticize their own deviant behavior. Another utopian feature that persisted after 1989 was the choice of the tabula rasa made by the new intellectual government that came to power in 1996. The shock therapy proposed by Jeffrey Sachs was chosen for founding the new society, a typical utopian choice when one considers the 19th century attempts. The utopian city is always built from nothing. While the shock therapy had been proposed as a solution right from the start and Visegrad Group countries had adopted it in the early 1990s, it took Romania several years to endorse the policy, and it did so only when a coalition of parties mainly formed by intellectuals came to power. Finally, the debates about and the widespread agreement regarding the Romanian mentality being the main obstacle to the creation of economic wealth, along with the attempts to reform it, are nothing but a reflection of a socialist education that was dedicated to the building of a new man or the new society. The new man obsession is the most constant feature of socialist thinking, from its utopian through to its totalitarian forms in the 19th and 20th centuries, and it is a feature most criticized in dystopian accounts. Is it by chance that the disenchantment with the Western model starts after 2002, when Romanians are granted permission to circulate without a visa within the European Union? Realistic images of the mythical West then arriving in Romania But they do so in a moment when economic growth is bringing concrete promises and the overall economic situation is improving, which cancels out the potential political consequences. In fact, all the elections from 2004 to 2012 confirms the path to democracy, and Romania's joining of the European Union in 2007 leaves no room for reconsideration of the directions of the transition. But this choice becomes more and more pragmatic and mobilizes imagination less and less. Is the West providing the wrong moral model, or is there an inability to adhere to something that finally proves to be less perfect than initially imagined? Also, the will to join the European Union has always been very strong in Romania. The enthusiasm for the Western model fades in the years 2000, accelerated by the Western treatment of the 2007 economic crisis. During the 2010s, Romania boasted an annual economic growth of up to 5%, and wages increased, as did living standards. However, the better life, the more equal relations between men and women, and other signs of social progress do not seem to satisfy the new social order. And interestingly enough, some forms of nostalgia for the socialist period appear among its most fervent critiques. At the beginning of the 2010s, new leftist movements appear in Romania that, for the first time, contain no reference to the state socialist period, but criticize the excesses of capitalism. This could be thought of as no more than an alignment with Western leftist movements and the result of a loss of memory about what state socialism was. But it goes beyond that to a disenchantment with the limits of the new system and its lack of imagination of the good. The case study I have chosen to examine in this paper in order to argue for the importance of an unreachable ideal to support the existence of moral values is that of an ideology, socialist utopia. Other anthropologists have provided evidence of a similar need to imagine perfection through the study of religious belief or art. I could have also emphasized how the importance of faith in post-socialist Romania keeps people going, even though its lack of direct incidence on the political government leaves it out of the political and moral imagination and limits it to the moral imagination of inter-individual interaction. As frequently stated already, several moral frameworks coexist in every society, and the socialist idealist framework coexisted with the religious and liberal ones in Romania at the time of my research. But there are several reasons why I chose to develop the need for utopia as transcendence rather than the need for belief as transcendence. First, I chose utopia because it is about reason, and its transcendental motivational capacities are even more paradoxical. Second, this choice was based on the fact I could not compete with a significant amount of research that had already been done within the cognitive anthropology of religion, given my later gathering of data on the Orthodox religion in Romania and Moldova. Third, my choice was motivated by the particularity of my area study. What is unique in Eastern Europe and can bring new data to anthropological thinking is its lived experience of a utopian dream that has kept almost the whole of humanity busy for at least the past 2 centuries. There is no doubt that the data I collected during the transition period from state socialism to a market economy was profoundly influenced by this unique experience. Lastly, there are in Western Europe today new forms of utopia that come to life because of the need for transition to a sustainable society. While past experiences of utopia turned dystopia could never prevent new experience from taking place, these past experiences should be a warning. And if political pragmatism becomes the rule of law, the impossibility of being driven towards a more sustainable society without the existence of utopian dreams could be another warning. To conclude, 2001 Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick's 1968 anticipatory film, presents 2 powerful images of prehistoric life. The first shows our human predecessors discovering tools and their use in combat. It shows them communicating and forming alliances in order to survive. The second shows them standing stunned in front of an obelisk that seems to emerge from the center of the earth and reach to the sky, experiencing awe in the presence of something that goes beyond the usual daily life. If the need for cooperation has helped humans develop evaluative capacities, followed by social norms and principles for survival purposes, the need to reach beyond ordinary life, in the face of the celestial sky, the infinite, has contributed to strengthening and enriching these same evaluative capacities. One case study, even though it comes from large-scale history, is not able to prove this true. It could, however, stimulate questions that will inspire research able to reformulate a comprehensive hypothesis of the origin and nature of human morality. Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for that, Monica. I'm going to go straight on to our next speaker, who is Radu Umbrez. And just to introduce Radu, he's an anthropologist interested in cognitive and evolutionary approaches to social interaction and cultural evolution. Radu is lecturer in anthropology at SNSPA Bucharest and holds a PhD from UCL. His thesis and postdoctoral fellowships at Institut John Nicod, ENS, and New Europe College led to a subsequent book, Living with Distrust, Morality and Cooperation in a Romanian Village, published with Oxford University Press. Other research interests of his include folk epistemology, deception, ethnic essentialism, and social ontology. So we're very pleased to have you here, Radu. Without any further ado, could you take it away, please?
Hi, thank you so much, Matthew. I hope you can hear me from my second account. Well, you can see me on the other one. So I will begin with a piece I call The Ethnographer as Research Instrument. Taking issue with certain relativistic positions, Maurice Bloch and Rita Stuti wrote that anthropologists are studying Homo sapiens, not people from the planet Zog. While agreeing with their position, I consider that the statement may also be rephrased, keeping its truth value while shifting the focus of attention. Anthropologists themselves are Homo sapiens and not people from planet Zog. Cognitive scientists in general, whether anthropologists, psychologists, or philosophers, experience firsthand the very phenomena they are studying in others. Researchers have minds, and they are cultural beings with histories and social relationships of their own. When studying other human beings, the ethnographer's minds and their extended embodied cognition are tools, instruments for an empirical study of a society or a culture. For example, our capacities for reading other minds, for communication, for translation and symbolic thinking are harnessed to the ethnographic project. These are arguably universal and generic human traits, but what happens when the moral inclinations of ethnographers are involved? Today, I want to discuss some of my personal experiences during fieldwork. By no means do I take them as illustrative of the discipline, especially due to some idiosyncrasies I will shortly explain. But I want to argue that sometimes methodological aspects of ethnographic research are entangled with the theories developed by ethnography. On the one hand, the mental inclinations of ethnographers may act as heuristic tools for anthropological interpretation. On the other hand, the ethnographic experience itself may be used as a natural experiment of anthropological theories of social interaction. The subject I propose for reflection today is an ethnography of morality, trust, and cooperation, whose methods revolve around the very topics it aims to study. The case study is an intimate relationship between an ethnographer and some of the subjects of ethnography. Now, onward to my fieldwork, and I've called this part a convenient fieldwork in inconvenient times. I will not read this part, I'll just try to express it. So I prepared my fieldwork in Athens, Greece, in 2007, 2008, and where I wanted to study migrant entrepreneurs. I already had connections in the field. I had set up my research plans when the economic crisis hit. And overnight, most of the people I knew were jobless, they closed down their businesses, and many of them were heading home. So I was basically left without a field and without a subject. However, I had one connection. Now, one of the people I contacted was Mihai. Mihai was a builder, and he started a business. He helped me get in contact with many people, and we had a very good relationship. But there was something more, because Mihai was not just another Romanian in Greece. He was my first cousin. So when the crisis hit, he called me, and he said he was moving back to his home village, the village where my mother had been born some 70 years before. Without any other options, I just jumped at the opportunity, and I drove his car back home because he could drive around Athens without a valid driver's license, but he couldn't negotiate two borders and such a long trip. Of course, it wasn't ethnography yet, but then I arrived in that village and I decided that this was the best I could get. So then I ended up staying 2 years in that village that I will call Săteni in northeast Romania, and I adapted. There were also some return migrants who were developing businesses, and I decided to look at this phenomenon. But then my questions, new questions arose, and in the end, after those 2 years and after a PhD, I delivered an analysis of trust and cooperation and of moral reasoning in general, based on my fieldwork in this village. Now, so what were some of the theories I found illuminating? Now, the concept of fairness played a large part in my anthropological interpretation of social interactions. Fairness is one of the fundamental domains of morality in the popular model of Jonathan Haidt, which builds on an interdisciplinary conversation involving anthropologists such as Richard Schroeder and other social scientists. The approach places fairness next to care, loyalty, authority, and purity as universal moral foundations which appear in various modulations across individuals and cultures. However, my emphasis on fairness was more in line with Baumar, Sperber, and Andre, who consider mutualism as the main mental inclination for moral judgment and moral behavior. In their view, moral inclinations have evolved to help us be picked up as social partners in a market of cooperation. In the end, I found their model to be more parsimonious and helpful to compare different forms of cooperation and conflict in Săteni. One of the main ways I interpreted ethnographic data was that Săteni villagers represented and behaved towards relatives as if kinship was a moral contract based on fairness, which endured or ended by trust and cooperation. Yet perhaps there was a reason why I focused on fairness and mutuality above other possible concepts and causal models. Retrospectively, my biography in the village was a natural experiment for the theoretical models of Săteni morality composed during and after fieldwork. I started by studying entrepreneurship, but the ethnographic experience pushed me into more general questions. Why did people distrust each other so much, telling me to always be careful in social interaction because I will be cheated or preyed on? How did they choose whom to trust or not? I became interested in patterns of cooperation conflict in social interactions, in the transmission of cultural representations of morality, and in moral reasoning within and between people. Among the many domains of social life, kinship came to the fore as a core moral language, but also as a field of grievous moral conflicts. For me, in pragmatic terms, having relatives in the village helped me get closely acquainted to many people, first kin, then kin of kin, and friends of kin and other associates. I was included in a construction team led by my cousin, entered the houses of many for work and leisure. I could sit at dinner tables and travel for political campaigning. In a society widely considered as low trust by social scientists such as Romania, kin relationships offer a foothold in many households and intimate affairs, as well as the public persona. For better or worse, I was not a stranger, but a fellow Romanian with local origins and connections. Observed today as an object of study, my moral relationships with kin had a strong mutualistic aspect. I reactivated old and feeble kinship ties because I needed support for fieldwork. Just like Săteni remember their faraway or neglected relatives when they need help. They shared their homes and time with me, but so did I when I offered to drive them around and help with various errands. Nothing was overtly and purely transactional, but we intuitively contributed to each other's welfare with a reciprocal assistance, which reactivated the passive mutuality of being, to rephrase Salen's words. Revising fieldwork in chronological order, I could notice how my understanding of Săteni society changed in time. My early reflections recorded more of the warm side of kinship, its default trust and intense cooperation. No wonder, perhaps, since I was also experiencing the support of my relatives who welcomed me and set me up in Săteni. It was, metaphorically, my happy childhood. I could observe, but also experience how kinship brings, ceteris paribus, a default set of moral expectations, the famous axiom of kin amity, right? Maior fortes. As an embedded observer, I could study the networks of reciprocal assistance linking household economies, politics, migration, and rituals. I had an easy time introducing myself and my work to people I met. My kin ties with aunts and uncles, cousins and nephews, their affins and ritual kin were known to most villagers, especially since these relatives introduced me around. I told everyone that I was an anthropologist studying their community and their ways of life, but most people were more interested in locating me on the social map by lines of descent and marriage. My identity as Radu, son of Anna, daughter of Ioan Cataranchu, prevailed over my identity as a doctoral student at a British university studying their village society. Then I began to notice cracks in the story that kinship necessarily engenders morality. Kinship brought amity and cooperation, but not always, and not towards everyone. I started to notice how close ties of blood can be denied when social interactions are sour, how distant genealogical relationships are picked up and elevated to communicate out a close mutualistic relation in the present. Sometimes kinship brought mutuality, cooperation, and trust, but other times it created moral perils, gaps between normative expectations and practical performances, interpersonal and intrapersonal conflicts. All the while, I began to see that not all my relatives are kind to one another, and some became sworn enemies. Even the closest kin relationships could dissolve, and friendship turned into kinship by ritual could be stronger than blood. The tensions of partial inheritance, enforced social proximity, and unequal social mobility sometimes turned relatives into competitors. When such stories came from my relatives, I could compare the situation with what happened to unrelated subtenies, and the stories matched. Relatives fuck you worse than the devil, I heard said, and later understood to be an accurate evaluation. Since one trusted kin, they invested more in them than in other people, exposed themselves to reneging on reciprocity or even predation. They fuck you because you lower your guard, is the implicit meaning and warning of the proverb. I also became involved in such problematic social intercourse. I had two distant cousins of about the same genealogical closeness. One of them I had already met in Greece, and he was an associate of my close kin and a political ally to some of them. I spent time with him and learned a lot about local politics, the sheep business, but he was the arch enemy of my other cousin, an important political and local strongman. I was not acknowledged as a relative by the latter and treated with distrust and socially avoided. Now, having a connection with one meant I lost access to many people intimately associated with my relative in denial. This was a window into the way kin ties are strategically affirmed or denied, but also into how moral relationships with one relative deny the possibility of moral relationships with another one when coalitional allegiances are imposed. Reflecting now, I think that fairness was central to my experience as a newcomer into the village, where I appeared as a potential social partner or competitor as defined by my kin ties. Perhaps other identities could have made other moral inclinations more salient to the ethnographic perspective, such as a sense of loyalty or purity, had I been from another country or of another religion. Thus, people assumed I was not that different from them in terms of thinking and moral and social norms. Moreover, my own moral inclinations for fairness, or the way they were modulated in this new social environment, made me pay more attention to such mechanisms as reputation, trust, and mutualistic cooperation. So, were these intuitions unconscious biases or necessary heuristic tools for theory building? And I come now to the last part, I call intuition and reflection in ethnography. Ethnography may involve two different ways of thinking and acting. Ethnography is, on the one hand, a reflexive process of interpreting a society, collecting data and creating models of reality. Ethnographers are aware of their deliberative mental processes. They develop arguments in their mind and put them into writing, supporting theories with evidence and challenging other theories and bodies of evidence. However, I believe that the methodology of ethnography is based on intuitive mechanisms. Hildred and Clifford Geertz were included as insiders after a police raid when they went into hiding just like the other villages, inducing a cross-cultural sense of friendly complicity and trust. When Dan Sperber was asked by an informant to kill a fantastical creature, he started thinking about why he did not automatically trust his informant. One could also wonder what happens when ethnographers are adopted by their families and see the dynamics of kinship beyond biological ties, as perceived by Janet Carsten and Rita Scuti and many others. All along the ethnographic process, anthropologists carry on with known and unbeknownst mental processes. Much has been said about the cultural biases carried by ethnographers into the field. Perhaps it should also be said that the intuitions of ethnographers as Homo sapiens and not as people from Planet Zog, are often turned into descriptive and explanatory models of society, culture, and minds. The risk is to turn unconscious motivations and schemas into biases for anthropological interpretation and social theory. In my publications, I have written about conflict and cooperation between relatives from a neutral perspective, the view from nowhere. Corroborating my interpretations with other ethnographies of rural Romania and peasant life in general, I'm satisfied that certain models proposed in the ethnography have validity and accuracy. Yet some questions arise when reflecting upon the thoughts and emotions afforded by my own position in the village society. I believe now that unreflective mental mechanisms and intuitive methods of establishing social relationships in the field have guided my theoretical analysis. One outcome of being involved in the phenomenon under study, the morality of kinship in this case, is that the ethnographer has access to private experiences which simulate or emulate the famous native point of view. Affective responses and cognitive schemas in the mind of the ethnographer could thus give an inkling into what the natives think and feel. Undoubtedly, many, if not all ethnographers reflect upon their own cognitive processes and emotions during fieldwork. The famous example being Renato Rosaldo's paper on grief and the headhunter's rage. Just as I experienced feelings of safety and attachment among my relatives and friends, I also felt anger after some social interactions. One was a vicious quarrel with my dearest cousin Mihai, when construction work arrangements conflicted with our respective expectations of respect and cooperation. While he needed a trusted hand on deck, I was more interested in collecting data and asking questions, shirking on work duties. Becoming free from obligations towards one relative allowed me to direct my attention, emotions, and resources to nurturing other social ties of kinship or friendship beyond my initial starting point. While my intuitions of fairness and mutuality served as moral affordances to build or end social relationships, they also became the focus of my theoretical analysis. So what if ethnographers are elevating private experiences to the role of unconscious hypotheses and models of the society under study? What seems to the self like an objective process of deliberation might actually be motivated reasoning, a non-cognitive bias to seek arguments only in favor of our intuitions and interests. Methodological interests of building relationships to gain access to private affairs and private thoughts guided my ethnographic experience of making friends and joining coalitions, working along certain kinship ties but not others. Since such social relationships thrived on mutualism, I might have focused much of my attention on generalizing from lived experience of kinship as a moral contract towards general patterns of social interaction. However, even beginning from one particular position is an exercise in cutting out a path through enormous social complexity. All ethnographers have to start somewhere and somehow. They carry their own intuitions and cultural representations of morality and encounter people with their own moral intuitions and cultural representations of morality. In one way or another, my methodology based on observation and participation built upon social interaction with the Sateni villagers, where the ethnographer is a moral subject just as much as his informant. The way I was treated by Sateni villagers and the way I treated them during ethnography might thus reflect both a universal moral grammar and a particular process of intersubjectivity influenced by history, culture, and the idiosyncrasies of studying your own relatives. The final point I want to make is that our anthropological theories of social interaction should be able to account for the ethnographic method which leads to data collection and interpretation. In my case, moral inclinations for fairness and mutuality guided the ethnographic encounter between the anthropologist and the natives before becoming a subject for theory making. I reflected upon the intuitions of others and proposed explanatory mechanisms before reflecting upon my own intuitions, as I try to do today. Perhaps, as I try to suggest, such entanglements between theory and methodology may be useful byproducts of the ethnographic process. So, thank you very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Radek, for that very interesting and very rich contribution, which came in perfectly just in time. So that's great. Thank you. So now I'd like to move on to our last contributor, who's Giulia Casaniti. Just to briefly introduce Giulia. Giulia is an associate professor of psychological and medical anthropology at Washington State University. She is the author of the single author monograph Living Buddhism, Mind, Self and Emotion in a Thai Community, and Remembering the Present, Mindfulness in Buddhist Asia, both of which are published with Cornell University Press. And she is also the editor of the collected volume Universalism Without Uniformity, Explorations in Mind and Culture. So take it away when you're ready, please, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Hi, everyone. I'd like to thank the organizers and all the participants and all these amazing speakers. It's been really exciting. I'm really honored to be here. I think this is the first workshop I've been at that's been expanded over a week or a week and a half. And it's been really nice in some ways to have that time so that I can think with some of the talks. It's been really useful. And so I thought I would try a little bit to incorporate some of the points that have been made this past week and a half or 2 weeks here into what I've been thinking about and what I can offer today. It's a little bit fraught to do that because it's kind of new, but I thought I'd try, in particular, that point that Michael Lambeck, you were making about meta judgment and how we're thinking about how people are evaluating our own moral judgments. And also what Jarrett Zagon was saying about relational ethics and the idea of interpersonal attunement. So I thought I'd think about some of this in order to kind of contribute a little bit to thinking about cognitive moral frameworks in theorizing methodologies in the anthropology of ethics. I work in Thailand. I do my research in a Northern Thai Buddhist community. I've been going there about twice a year now for the past 18 years or so. So I've gotten to know the people pretty well there. I write about how Buddhist ideas have been influencing concepts of self and others, and how these are interpreted and how people are making sense of their own health and well-being. I've written about morality, mostly in terms of the morality of emotion and how people in the monastery, in the Buddhist monastery and out of the monastery, are navigating and negotiating particular kinds of emotional practices and the micropolitics of these kinds of ethical engagements. But today I want to talk about my own moral dilemmas in the field. And I want to tell you about probably the two most kind of dramatic, or at least to me, the most marked moral crises that I've faced. And I want to tell you about what I did, or what I decided to do, and then what people that I was working with thought about what I did and why, and what that might tell us, or maybe contribute to thinking about the anthropology of morality. So the first example or short story I want to tell you about is about my friend Sen. Sen is a Buddhist man, about mid-30s, who I met and got to know quite well in the course of my field work. And he developed a very, very strong or very severe health problem with liver cirrhosis due to his alcoholism. And I had seen that develop, and I was really worried. I wasn't sure, how to help him. And when I left to go back home, and then I came back to see him again during one of my visits, I couldn't find him. And I went to his house, and his sister Gao said, well, he's just not doing well, go to his room and see. And so I went to the room and I found him there. His legs were swollen and his stomach was swollen and his skin and his eyes were yellow, and he could not really walk and could barely talk. And I was very upset, and I wanted to help, but I wasn't really sure what to do. I think as anthropologists, we're kind of taught not to really get too involved in the field or to alter the lives of our informants, to kind of objectively observe what's happening around us. And I think that's pretty much a pretty old idea now. I think we now know that our subject position is always implicated in what we're writing about. But I still think there's a little bit of a sense that we shouldn't get too involved in the way of altering what might have been happening if we hadn't been there at all. And I think even if we do say, all right, well, I'm going to be getting involved, or I've made a choice to get involved, usually it's because people want us to. They ask for help and say, can you please do something to help? And in this case, my friend Sen definitely did not want my help. He did not want to go to the hospital. He didn't want to get help for his illness. And so I was kind of left with this moral dilemma. I went and talked to his sister, Gao, and said, we need to do something. We need to do something right now. And I decided I need to act. And she said, well, I think maybe we should wait until he's ready to admit that he has a problem and wants to get help. Don't hamjai, to accept his problem. And she said, or let's wait till my parents come back to the village here. They were in Chiang Mai at a meditation retreat. She said, or let's wait till nighttime when it's quieter. And we talked about it. And I said, you know what? I think we need to do something right now. So we went to the police station at the end of the road, and we talked to the police there, who of course knew Sen also. It's a small town, and they had grown up with him also, and they agreed to get him help. So we went to his room, and he had barricaded the door, and he busted it down, and he had this big kitchen knife held up at us, and said, I'm not going. And so they said, well, we don't know what to do. And so finally, while he was sleeping, I managed to get the knife away, and they came back in and physically carried him out to the ambulance waiting on the street, and he was taken off to Chiang Mai. I'm still not really sure if I did the right thing there, but I'm not really sure what his family thinks either about that, in their own moral judgment of my moral decision. But I think that they think it's okay, and they still invite me back to their house all the time. So I think that they think it's all right. So that's the first instance I want to bring up. The second one is not as dramatic, but I think or not as dramatic socially, but I think it's still something that people, at least anthropologists, sometimes think about and have to deal with. And that's the decision I had to make, or am making, about whether to publish the book, my book, Living Buddhism, where I talk about this and other issues that came up around town in my book, Living Buddhism, into Thai. I was worried that people would say I was talking about their private personal lives, and maybe they wouldn't want me to. And I had already, of course, they had already agreed that I could write about them per the IRB and the Ethics Review Board at the National Research Council of Thailand. But I still was a little bit worried. I was definitely worried about it. I had published it already in English, but I wasn't really that worried about that because nobody in the town speaks English. And so I knew they wouldn't come across it. But I was worried about the Thai version because even though I changed their names and the name of the town, of course, they would be able to figure out who was who. And I just wasn't sure. But at the same time, I did want it. I thought it would be a good idea to do, in the sense of sharing the knowledge, with people in Thailand, not just people who knew English, kind of that sense of distributing our research and sharing with the people in the host country. So I decided, and this was just this past December, like about a year ago now, that what I should do is I should give my field informants a copy of the manuscript draft in Thai that I was working on with my colleague Ajahn Samwang Gyalsufong at Chiang Mai University. And I would have, and see what they said, and see what they said I should do. Sen wasn't able to read it. And his sister Gao, when I left in January, still hadn't gotten to it, but my host sister Goy, she read it, and I nervously waited for a couple weeks while she was reading it. And finally one day she sat down, we sat down over breakfast, and she told me her verdict. Julia, she said, well, you got a few things wrong. And she told me about a couple instances, like she said that I had represented a situation involving her that I hadn't really known about, how she was secretly actually worried about her brother and her brother Ta's drug problems. And she said, and there were parts that I laughed at, and she said, but I understand that this wasn't really something about whether it was right or wrong in its correctness about exactly everything going on, but rather your subjective view or your take on what was happening at the time. She said, if it was somebody else that came in here and wrote this and then, came and published it, she said, I think I would not really be okay with it. But you come back here a lot, and I know you care about the community, so it's okay. And what she said about her reasoning for that, about how I came back a lot and I cared about the community, something struck me about that, and it made me kind of rethink some of the other moral dilemmas I'd had when I was in the field, and in the case with Sen, and the idea of kind of getting him help and getting him to the hospital. It made me realize that I had a different kind of ethical framework that I was using, or kind of bringing into the context or the situation, than I think my field informants had. And I think that what I was thinking when I had been making these moral judgments had, in a sense, been about, well, in the case of Sen, I thought, well, even though he might not want to go to the hospital, if I get him there, he'll get help. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. But I was also worried and unsure, because isn't it his right to not, have to do things he doesn't want to do? I think what I was thinking about here, and also in the case of Goy, I was worried about her thinking, well, I had represented her incorrectly or not in a good light. And I think where I was coming from when I was making these moral decisions is about what Rick Schrader would talk about as an ethic of autonomy. I was worried about the harm I was causing to the individuals. And I think what the people I was interacting with had their own kind of different cultural logic or their different kind of moral mental framework for thinking about these and making their moral decisions. I think for him, or at least for him and his sister and for Goy, I think there was a different kind of logic or ethic at play. I think that, Sen didn't want to go to the hospital because he didn't want to get shots in his arm. That's what he told me. He didn't, of course, want to change his lifestyle, but he also didn't want people to see him being brought out to the street. And he didn't want to really kind of disrupt the community around him. He didn't really want to disrupt the harmony, or what the Thai scholar Ratchawit Hotiarat calls the harmony of Grengjai, or a kind of respectful deference for the peace of the social scene, not just about himself, but really about his parents, his family, the kind of social harmony. I think his sister too, in saying, his sister Gao saying, well, let's wait till night, she was talking about not disrupting the scene there, and kind of what I think maybe is more familiar in a sense related to that Chinese idea of saving face. But I think in a Thai context, it's a little bit like that, but I think there's a little bit more of an interpersonal element of it in Thailand. And I think Goy too, in her judgment, she wasn't really talking about her own feeling of whether I was right or if she was represented well, but rather about her sense of the environment, about the community that she was in. And I think the sense of my role as being part of that. And this, of course, is what Rick Schrader refers to as the ethic of community. And I should note here that Rick was my PhD advisor at Chicago. And even after 10 years of having graduated, I'm still learning from him. So thank you, Rick. So I think that this kind of way of thinking really helps me to pay attention to some of the ethical works that were at play in the interactions that I was having. I think it's not just a sense of community, though, in valuing the group over itself, that I think is irrelevant here. I think it's also that the self is quite differently understood. Now, Michael Lambic mentioned the other day about how, there's, working with certain concepts of the self. And if we mention, if we talk about, there are different concepts of the self at play in non-Western contexts, but that's, so much to get into. And I think that's totally okay, especially when you're talking about Western contexts. But I think for someone like me and others of us that are working in non-Western contexts, I think it is really important to go there and to really think about and interrogate the idea of the self, especially when we're thinking about relationality, this sense of the kind of how is it between us that Jarrett was bringing up. I think that this is especially true in Buddhist contexts in Thailand, where concepts of the self are really, really complicated. Rather than the self as a kind of a priori, metaphysically and ontologically autonomous center of being, as it is in, I think, a lot of Western contexts, the Buddhism that's followed by my field interlocutors teaches that there's really no such thing as self at all. Instead, there's this concept of non-self, or anatta, one of the three characteristics of life, along with dukkha, non-satisfactoriness, and anicca, impermanence. This sense of non-self instead is constituted, this illusion of the self becomes constituted by what's called khandha, or aggregates, these kinds of passing conditionalities, these moments or contingencies of situations, sensations, perceptions, affective interpersonal influences that create an illusion of the stable self. In addition to this kind of metaphysical non-self, there's also concepts of the person, I think, that are relevant, that are circulating in the community, that have to do with the multiple spirits of the self. One's souls or spirits are understood to be able to scatter and get lost, and then they get brought back together and they intermingle with the energies of others, not just other people, but interpersonal energies from beyond the human. And Tanya Lerman and I have been examining some of these perspectives in the self in work on spiritual phenomenology. And I think they're also understood to be part of what's at play when people are interacting with others. I think when Gao and Goy, and to some extent Sen, were making moral judgments with me, I think these senses of the interdependence of the selves were at play. Gao knew me and trusted me as part of her own communal shared self, making our actions around Sen at least somewhat okay. and Goy too evaluated her judgment of my actions based on the fact that in a way I cared about and was part of herself and community. And because of that, it was okay for me to publish the book. So what can we make of all this? I may be referring here to a kind of transcendental ethics in Joel Robbins' sense that, you know, I'm using religious ideas and understanding how they're influencing people's decisions. But also, it may be referring to a kind of ordinary ethics in the sense of people's moral judgments being drawn out of the interactions of everyday experience. For my purposes here, I don't think it's as important to say, you know, exactly that it's one or the other. Rather, I think what is important, or what here is the understanding of where my field interlocutors were coming from. In that it helps me to avoid projecting my own moral sensibility onto them, and rather instead to kind of ethically attune to them, to understand our sense of relationality. So to kind of be able to understand where they're coming from rather than put my own moral framework onto the context that I'm working to understand. I think it's also worth pointing out that what I'm describing here is not just a set of virtues or moral goods in a culturally variable virtue ethics kind of way, as Hans Steinmuller had said the other day in arguing for the force and potency about the different kinds of drug destruction ethics or at play in the Wa state, which is an area near where I work in Thailand, you know, linguistically and culturally similar. I think that it's not just, as he was pointing out, I don't think it's just a set of virtues that people are drawing from. I think rather these are kinds of almost like a field of merit, to draw on a locally salient metaphor, or a field of morality or a framework, or these kinds of heuristics that people are drawing from when they're evaluating others' actions and interacting with them. I think this attention to the mental frameworks at play in my ethical dilemmas in Thailand can help us in anthropology of morality in a few ways. I think for me, they help me just understand my ethnographic field site a little bit more. They help me understand not just my interactions with others, but also people's interactions with each other. And I think in a sense that kind of draws attention to just the idea that really, in a way, our goal is to really understand what it is that we're trying to describe. And I think that this attention to the interpersonal models, the mental models at play of the self may be worth considering, not just for me in Thailand, but also in other contexts too, in other kinds of field sites. And finally, I think they help to push our methodologies further by kind of admonishing us, or to attend to our interlocutors' sense of moral practice. I think maybe 50 or 60 years ago, there was this sense that we, you know, write about the other and in a subjective way, and then we, you know, kind of describe it in that sense. And I think after the postmodern turn, we learned to incorporate our own positionality into our ethnographic analyses. But I think the field is now keen to incorporate our field interlocutors, not just into our projects, but I think it's time to recognize that it's not just necessarily about them being involved in what we're up to, but rather to create projects that are made in and through an attention to the moral frameworks and the moral traditions that matter to our field interlocutors. So I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, so much for what was a very interesting and very lucid talk. And also thank you for trying to incorporate other people's talks and concepts into that, which I think is very useful going forward into the discussions that we're going to be having. So it's just past 4:30. I suggest that we take a just under 10-minute break. So if we all reconvene back at 20 minutes to 5 to have a discussion. Hello there, everyone. Welcome back. And I'm just going to pass things over now to Demet, who's a colleague of ours at Sussex. But just to briefly introduce Demet to all of you, Demet Dinle holds a PhD in development studies from SOAS, University of London. She is currently a lecturer at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex, where she previously held the Helena Normanton Fellowship. She specialises in multi-sited ethnographies of local and global markets, markets and morality, class relations, and post-capitalist solidarity economies. She has been a long-term activist, organiser, and practitioner in the fields of labour and gender. So take it away, please, Demet. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
No, I can't. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to be discussing for these kind of brilliant presentations. And I'm very sorry that I missed the previous two workshops because of work commitments during the whole week last week. And I'm very pleased to be able to be here today. I will start with Richard, and thank you to all the presenters who shared their presentations with me yesterday so that I had a chance to read some of the papers. Richard Schroeder's eloquent and succinct revision of philosophical and anthropological debates on morality and his lucid defense of pluralism was a real treat and reminded me of Sabah Mahmoud's powerful ethnography criticizing Western feminism's approach to illiberal women's movement in Egypt, and how virtues of piety and docility, which deviate from liberal understanding of freedom, are still forms of agency. So I kind of really could relate to what he was talking, because I think it also destabilized some of my early assumptions when I was an activist back in my country. I share fully his critique of developmentalism and would like to elaborate two questions. I do understand that your pluralist position does not exclude the possibility of evaluative judgments. If this is the case, what would be the foundations for such judgments to be made? Would there be any ground on which we could make an immanent, not external, critique of liberal or illiberal life forms without falling into developmentalism? For example, in a recent book, the German philosopher Rahel Jahegi suggests we can still criticize other life forms by investigating the capacity of these norms to change, adapt to the conflicts and structural pressures generated by these very life forms. So if you follow your case study of eating fish, we would need to understand what kind of contradictions the rules imposed on widows create in society and how people handle these, and whether they are sufficient to be able to respond to people's needs and desires. So if your answer is a moral realism without ethnocentrism, where do you find the foundations, the starting points for such kind of realism? My second question is a little bit to unpack the issue of the problem of moral values. What would happen if we were to change our look from the values themselves to the way the values are negotiated in everyday life? Would we be able to see then more connections than differences between various cultures? And again, I tried to create an hypothetical example. I took the liberty to do so. I'm hoping that it's not that far stretch. Let us assume that widowed woman, in your case, developed a secret ritual of having sex and eat fish at a particular day of the month to restate and celebrate past sacred conjugal relation by a profane practice, perhaps similar to many other rituals where restoration of order is made possible by a performance of disruption. Could we see in this type of ritual a transcendental attempt to reconcile individual desire for autonomy and communal values, which can also be seen in liberal societies? Could we then talk about some fundamental questions all societies try to answer, as Maurice Bloch would talk about, apart from totally different moral values? Could we perhaps, just to be provocative a bit, I don't have a clear answer to that, salvage some form of universalism from the prison of moral absolutism and developmentalism? So I think what I try to do is to kind of invite you to open up the last questions that you ask in your paper. Monica Heim's paper, on the other hand, is a very creative way to think about morality in terms of utopia and dystopia, which honestly I hadn't thought about before. I find the universal search of people for a virtuous life as the basis of morality quite appealing and promising. And in fact, it made me think about Saint-Simonian utopias in the 19th century, where the working class people were drawn to those Saint-Simonian utopia of free love, equality, liberty, not because of bread and butter issues in ordinary life, but because of the metaphysical questions about the meaning of life in a way to evoke the space odyssey reference that Monica is talking about at the end of her paper. And I must say that in my own ethnography of working class organizing back in Turkey, I could see the importance of this utopian discourses as a way to bond people and just to develop forms of morality, even if, of course, they sometimes deviated from everyday life. If I understand correctly, the search for utopia, according to your argument, is transcendental, but the form it takes is historical and context specific, as the differences between Romania and Moldova suggest. Although I know you are not going into the depth of these cases in your paper, I think there are still very useful hints. So the one is based on social justice in the context of post-socialism because of all the contradictions of the market economy. And the other one is based on social harmony. And even though deceits and lies in the second one can look like immoral, they make sense within the broader moral framework of harmony, opening up space for forgiveness and acceptance, I presume, rather than purity, which brings me back again to an immanent understanding of morality, which I find quite useful. If this is the case, if utopias have a transcendental but also historical dimension and can be very, very different, and if we if I can relate this to Richard Schroeder's argument, then how, as he asks in his paper, can we relativize and parochialize our own Western conceptions of utopia, which pertain to specific types of moral value? In a recent paper, Liz Fuchsman aims to understand, for example, why South African poor were not attracted to the Western idea of universal basic income, which they thought would offer money to people who don't deserve it. The moral imaginaries of South African poor, or to translate into Monica's vocabulary, their utopia, was one in which the state assumed a moral responsibility to create secure jobs for regular wage work, rather than free cash transfers to everyone so that they do not have to work. So from my perspective, wage labor is slave labor and people should enjoy more leisure than work. But from the perspective of the workers who have little access to regular work, universal basic income does not really resonate their own understanding of what moral responsibility is, what the duty of the citizen and of the worker is. The thought-provoking paper by Radu Umbrecht is very interesting, not least because I did ethnographic work in a farming community bonded with kinship ties, where I observed, similar to him, so much distrust, enmity, rivalry, and grudge. So I really appreciated a lot the way he problematized his own position as kin and how his intuitions within the everyday practices of community life might slip into some misleading evaluative judgments. In my own ethnographic study, I was finding so disturbing to see deceits, gossips, slanders, until the day I was subject to those myself and risk losing my chance to continue my research even. And I realized I started taking position by having allies so that I'm less exposed to risk, still knowing that this trust could be broken in the same way community members do. So suddenly my penetration into the community was no longer a researcher's penetration, but someone who really wants to survive, and many things started making more sense. So in my view, your position as kin, as researcher, as individual who reacts to conflicts and takes sides, are multiple facets of a complex personhood whose biography is entangled with others, is really an opportunity, as you are telling at the end of your paper, an opportunity rather than a barrier. Your paper made me think that rather than perhaps enforcing an artificial original assumption about self-reflexivity in the field, we need to consider self-reflexivity as a genuine process emerging from the enactments of these complex personhood. But I would still appreciate that if you could unpack a bit more the concept of intuition and its analytical currency in ethnographic research in relation to those cognitive and emotional evaluations. And because I didn't get a clear sense of what you mean by intuition, at least analytically. I could, of course, understand what you wanted to say. And finally, Julius Kazaniti's presentation was a very elegant discussion of our own moral dilemmas as ethnographers and how we should not project our own moral sensibilities onto others, but rather understand where they come from. And I cannot, I think I don't have enough time because I'm finishing in 1 minute. My own experiences, but I could so well relate to what you're talking about. Sometimes it can be emotionally crucifying to kind of be involved in those situations. In the case study you presented, we could see how the illusion of self and multiple splits of the self, which you probably grasped as a researcher so competently were more difficult to take into account once you started engaging in morally responsible behaviors as you define them. So I very much appreciate the call for inviting fieldwork interlocutors being involved in the research process. And I did the same when I was publishing my first book on workers in Turkish, though, when I invited some of my informers to read the book and then kind of to give me feedback. And I remember how tense was this kind of waiting moment to hear their comments. But I think I can say that it's only rewarding. My take from your presentation is that we should not simply attempt to understand where fieldwork interlocutors come from, but also try to make them active agents of the process. But my question, and I finish with that question, could we also look at it from another direction? Are our interlocutors just passive subjects that we need to understand all the time? Aren't they curious of where we do come from? What is the background to our own moral sensibilities? And not only our own, but also other people who are not similar to them. And aren't they curious about different understandings of self? My experience suggests that, at least for some of my informants, understanding me and understanding others through their own ethnographic lens, problematizing, challenging, but also understanding and even learning from others, even if perhaps others had no intention to do so, was quite interesting and important. Could we then think of the self-reflexive ethnographic gaze in a double sense, where, while we try to make sense of our informants, of the world they inhabit, they also try to make sense of the world we inhabit and others inhabit, and those create moral dilemmas and possibilities for all of us. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thanks so much, Demet. So Demet kind of went through that very systematically, speaker by speaker. So my suggestion is that we just go in that order. So that would be Rick, Monica, Radu, and Julia. Just before the speakers have a chance to reply to those questions, I just want to remind everybody that after that round of responses, we're going to take questions from the floor. So if anybody does have any questions they'd like to ask, please put your name in the chat. So Rick, could you please give your response to the two questions that were asked by Demet? Rick, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay. First of all, Demet, what a responsible, eloquent set of comments that go right to the heart of the issues in these presentations. So thank you very much for doing that. Let me say a number of things in response. I hope I'll touch or at least address the questions you raised. First of all, I do agree that any absolutism that demanded uniformity, I would view as dogma, suppressing alternative ways of seeing things. So that's not the kind of absolutism I have in mind, because the level at which I'm characterizing absolutes is not one that addresses cases in contexts. It basically provides frameworks of things that would be seen as inherently good, which then become one of the ways in which you engage in critical anthropology, which is essentially to look at a practice. When you look initially, you're looking as an outsider. You have automatic reactions. You're reacting to something as though it was happening in your world, not in the other's world. And those have to be bracketed and held in abeyance until the end of the day, after you've understood the native point of view, after you've understood the local context. And it seems to me your responsibility as a critical anthropologist is always to say, show me the good. Can I possibly see something I recognize as a value or as a good, given my notion of the absolutes that are out there, which are these abstract frames of value, which include the rules, a diverse set of rules of moral reason and central existential issues which everyone has to confront. And it seems to me at the end of the day, you may well end up, indeed, I think you have to salvage universals of a sort. I call them contingent universals, which is after you finally understood the local context and the native point of view, you may well end up saying, and that's the way any reasonable, morally sensitive person ought to react under such circumstances. That's sort of the situational ethic part of it. I should put this in a broader, I mean, obviously you can only discuss limited amounts of things in a single presentation. My general philosophy, I suppose it's a philosophy of life and scholarship, I call Confucianism, and not to be confused with Confucianism, and its central proposition, several maxims go with it, but its central maxim is that the knowable world is incomplete if seen from any one point of view, incoherent if seen from all points of view at once, and empty if you try to see it from nowhere in particular. And given the, call it tragic choice between incompleteness, incoherence, and emptiness, which I do think is one of the things that comes from being situated human beings, I don't opt for incoherence. That's the end of intelligent conversation or scholarship. I don't like the dehumanizing distance that comes from certain forms of structuralism, which try to see things from nowhere. So I try to stay on the move between different points of view. The incompleteness is the way I view things. And so I'm trying to essentially have a broader, more complete view by understanding what are the goods that others are maximizing or striving to institutionalize, which may not be the subset of the goods that go on in my own tradition, but it's easy not to realize that that list of absolutes is quite broad and heterogeneous, and it's impossible to have all of them anywhere at one time. That's one of the things you learn, I think, from doing a moral anthropology. I also should confess to being something of a Pyrrhonist. Pyrrho of Elis is a certain form of skepticism, who's a skeptic, whose school of skepticism basically tries to get every position to get itself in its strongest possible form. When you have disagreements, you're not trying to go engage in combat, you're trying to approach each side and force through intelligent conversation, through assertion and denial, a defense of that perspective or way of life that's in its strongest form. And the assumption of a Pyrrhonist is that when diverse plural positions are gotten into their strongest form, you're no longer tempted to say, here's the winner. What the Pyrrhonist actually is trying to do is get you to have detachment from all of them, to not be a partisan. And it seems to me that there's a role for anthropologists to be that, not be partisans, at least with respect to those positions which lend themselves to the strength of a presentation that relates to some subset of these moral absolutes. An example, I suppose, of, and this of course assumes that everything's inherent, most things, not everything, but most things are inherently contestable. And that includes whatever has been made the orthodoxy in any particular tradition. It has suppressed something inevitably, given that only a subset of things have been privileged. And so there's always an internal dynamic within any cultural tradition for there to be the heterodox, or those who are trying to unsettle whatever is established and to institutionalize some other subset of goods that they want. And that ends up, of course, being much more of a political process than it is an intellectual one of trying to look for the moral rationale for something. Finally, an example of the way in which these absolutes get relativized, if I can use that term in a way that's understood in this context. I mean, let's just take the principle of justice, which in at least one of its forms says treat like cases alike and different cases differently. You go into a kinship structure, which is different from your own, and where inheritance patterns might work, such that, let's say, the males in the extended family are going to inherit the bulk of the family estate and not the daughters. And you look at that as an outsider and you might say, how unfair, until you come to understand enough about the relevant differences that are operating in their world so that you can see that it's a form of justice in which you're treating different cases differently. And in the Hindu families that I'm familiar with, at least in the temple town where I've worked, the daughters are going to move out. They're going to move into their husband's extended family, where they're going to assume an enormous amount of authority. The sons have the responsibility for taking care of their parents over time. The burden on them is different than the burden on the daughters. And their judgment that the inheritance should not be equally divided has a rationale to it in terms of a principle of justice, if properly understood and applied within the local tradition. So I've probably gone on a little too long already. I'll stop there, but thank you again for those questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Rick. So can we now move on to Monica? Are you there, Monica?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much. I really, I need to say the same thing as Rick Schroeder said. Thank you very much for your comments, Dana. They're really what you're saying about my example being both about this transcendental side of utopia, but also about how historically situated it is. It's really about this, actually. The utopia of socialism is this sort of dream of the common good, is historically situated. Definitely the South African workers that you were talking about are not part of this moral imaginary. They don't share this moral imaginary. So because of this, they don't want it necessarily. Quite surely, the cognitive scientists of morality who emphasize so much the role of social cooperation, of fairness and altruistic, they do share this dream of the common good. I mean, they call it the tragedy of commons when it doesn't happen. So yes, by saying that this is a historical movement, even if it lasted for 500 years and it will even last more, and this is part of our Western world, and it's difficult to think beyond it or behind it. Yeah, but it needs to be said as a critique on our own way of dealing with terms and concepts. Just one thing, however, when I was telling that, oh, well, it's probably not at the core of what I said today, but this sort of search for virtuous life that you are mentioning, by invoking the idea, the need for something that goes beyond like transcendental, something, an idea, an ideal. I am very Kantian in my way of looking at things, which is, it's not, ethics wouldn't be just about doing better and doing more and being more corporate and being nicer than, it's also about imagining these sort of models and ideals that go far beyond what we can actually do in our common life, but that help as a guide or as an unattainable ideal. So I wouldn't look just for a virtuous life, or I would also look for something that can't be in a way, if I look at what mobilizes people. That would be all from me. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks so much, Monica. So we'll now move on to Radu.
Hi. Thank you. Hi, Demet, and thank you so much for your very insightful comments, and thank you for sharing your own experience with such a phenomena. And your question is great, and it's such a great question. What are intuitions? How we can see them? How we can study them? By way of an explanation, of a definition, I would give you just a short ethnographic snippet, which is a moment when my cousin had just finished building a fence with another one of my cousins, and so they were together. There was no talk of how they're going to split up the fee, and then exactly at the end, the other cousin said, "Okay, let's split it 50-50." And my cousin Mihai went into a rage. So he was handed some money. He threw that money away immediately, and he drove off in a fury. He didn't even talk about it. There was no reflection there. It was just automatic. How I would say it, he intuitively felt that was an unfair offer. He thought, in his idea, another kind of split would have been fair. And then, so this was a kind of intuition, a fast, automatic process. And now reflecting back on my intuitions, I was also an observer of this, and I also intuitively analyzed that offer. And I also thought it was unfair in a way. Even before I could sort of get into the kind of reflexive ethnographic mode of what is going on, what is the structure of positions, that I've only done later. And when I did it later, I also reflected upon the intuitions of the cousin who made the apparently unfair offer, and why he considered that offer was fair from his point of view. So in a way, intuitions are those cognitive mechanisms which produce an automatic response, whether it is an emotion or a concept or an idea, while reflective thinking about morality is more about finding justification, thinking about of offering arguments for why you consider something as being right or wrong, whether it is within yourself, a sort of ethical reflection, or whether it is socially with others, to persuade or to persuade others or to explain yourself. And of course, this kind of intuition, we don't have access directly to them. We can only infer them. We cannot. We have access even to our own intuitions. We don't have necessarily access, or better said, we have direct access because they're just prompted into our minds. So it's such a great question, and I would love to elaborate more, but I guess here is not exactly the place. Thank you again so much, and thank you for to all the other speakers. It's been a really thought-provoking session.
That's great. Thanks so much, Radu. And so finally, Julia, we can move on to Julia now.
Really great comments and really interesting to think about. I'll just have a few thoughts here. I'm going to be thinking about what you were saying and kind of thinking about it over time, but just to offer a few thoughts on it. You mentioned the kind of sense of, well, what about others read on where we're coming from, and if that's kind of relevant in what's happening too. And I think definitely yes. I was thinking about it when you asked that, about how the examples that I offered with my friends San and Gao and my host sister Koi, I don't think they would have even humored me if they hadn't at least known me and been willing to kind of attune to where I was coming from also. And I think that was really useful that you pointed that out, that it's not just me kind of going there, but also them kind of coming towards me and finding that space in the interaction where we're creating this ethical moment together through their recognition of ame where I'm coming from and my own values or moral frameworks in what I'm up to. And I think the trust that came with that, or that comes with that, and I think other people I didn't know as well would not have even bothered. So I think that's really useful to think about. At the same time, I wonder, I was always struck when I was doing field work how a lot of the people I knew in the Buddhist community, they didn't really ask me a lot of questions about my own, where I was coming from, like not really that much at all. And it wasn't something I really noticed until I started working in this Christian Karen community just about 10 kilometers away. And there people would ask me all the time, what's snow like? What's the president like? What are washing machines like? They would ask me a lot about me. And it happened enough for people that didn't know each other that I started to pick up these habits or these kinds of practices. I think it has to do with kinds of international connections and religious networks, not just about kind of moral frameworks necessarily. But I wonder too, and I'll have to think about this more, just whether even the idea that I'm talking about relating to somebody else, even though I'm trying to break it down and say, okay, well, maybe there's no self that's really even being related to, still creates a dichotomy that maybe people may not be thinking about in the Buddhist context that I'm talking about, if that makes sense. So I guess it kind of gets at a meta recursive fallout where I could say, well, maybe this model of the interaction that's happening may be itself kind of culturally constituted. So I have to try to understand where they're coming from not necessarily having that, you know, getting to where I'm at and moving towards it. So I think there may be something there about the sense of what a kind of between space looks like if there isn't a sense of self in some way. So I need to think about that. And I also think, I wonder whether or not our field interlocutors have the same kind of responsibility we do to get to where we're coming from. You know, it may, I mean, I think it's always going to be there, but I just wonder whether or not there's something about the project that we're doing, getting into that space where maybe there is a little bit more on their end that we want to go towards them. So those are just some initial thoughts, but thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much, Julia. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and if anybody else wants to ask questions, please put them in the chat. So first of all, we've got a question from Webb Keen. Webb, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed it, the four of these, and I've seen, you know, a lot of. I'll try to be succinct. First, I guess I'll make just two comments. First, putting Radu and Monica's papers together, in thinking of them in light of the work that I've been trying to do. You might think of Radu as describing the world of the intuitive world of the first person, and these sort of face-to-face interactions of the second person, in the terms that I've tried to describe, sort of the process of ethicalization. Monica's describing the sort of the kind of transcendent or utopian or idealist world that Monica's describing is essentially something that requires the capacity for that third person perspective. So where the rubber hits the road, and this is where the kinds of historical problems that Monica is describing arise, the sort of difficulties of realizing utopias, is in finding a way to sort of care about what you imagine in the third world and bring it to life, make it inhabitable in the world of the first and second person, the world that Radu and in some sense Julia are describing. Now, I want to say something to Rick. So Rick, I'm very sympathetic to your sort of very traditional pluralist view of the anthropology, the ethos of anthropology, one that is under considerable assault or considerable pressure these days by our students. But there's a paradox here which I feel that you still haven't really addressed, and the paradox is that the very pluralism that you advocate is itself grounded in a liberal ethos, and that as Saba Mahmoud, I think, made very clear, it's one that would be, deeply rejected by many of the people that you were most committed to understanding. Now, so it seems to me that there are at least, and somehow I feel that we can't just sort of finesse that we have to recognize that this is a fundamentally paradoxical problem. Now, it seems to me that there are many possible responses, none of which I think has been fully realized. One of them, one of that is being realized is one that many of our students take, and that is to say, well, I just won't study others because I'm just going to steal. My job is not, in fact, the liberal task of understanding others, but rather of the task of understanding people whose moral values I am sympathetic with. The second is to recognize the possibilities of pluralism that are to be discovered even within hierarchical societies or sort of alternative moralities. And this, here I think of your example of the fish eater, which is the fact that this woman is eating fish suggests that the moral system is not a totalizing system, and it's one in which it's possible for her not to accept the moral values around her. And thus the task of the anthropologist of the sort of new style might be to seek out, first and foremost, an understanding of the heterodox. Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I don't know if Monica and Radu wanted to add anything to that before Rick gets a chance to respond. I think it's a no. No. Okay. Okay. So Monica?
I can just say that I fully agree, and thank you very much for putting the papers together. It's exactly about that, and the interesting thing is that it struck me like 20 years ago when I went to study work ethics in Romania. And it was all about how people are performing work, and you're having these sort of measurements in sociology. And then I had this meeting with Alan McFarlane in Cambridge, and he reminded me that God was watching. There was this, and in work ethic, what was important at the beginning was also God, that I was completely forgetting by just reading sociology. So thank you for your remark.
Okay, Radu, did you want to add anything to that? No, okay. So Rick, please go ahead.
Well, Webb, of course, raises a great, complicated question. The first thing I would say is that I think we have to be careful not to think that liberalism is one thing. I think there are varieties of liberalism, and indeed, if I had to state what my most general question of interest is or concern, it's the question, is it possible to be a robust cultural pluralist and a dedicated political liberal at the same time or not? A variation on that, of course, is what varieties of liberalism actually are pluralistic and which varieties aren't. Increasingly, liberalism, it seems to me, actually has become less and less pluralistic. And to the extent that it has a strong emphasis on autonomy and individualism, it ends up being liberationalist with regard to other societies which it thinks have entrapped people in traditions and the dictates of dead ancestors. So, in fact, I would go so far as to say, I don't think this is a radical idea, that colonialism is a liberal project. The white man's burden, or white woman's burden, as it was as well, is an interventionism which comes from an attempt to liberate people from customs that were thought to be backward or didn't have utilitarian outcomes or whatever. And I think that neo-colonialism and various universalizing humanistic NGO projects today are very similar. They're based on a certain kind of liberalism that is not pluralistic. So one has to then try to figure out what version of liberalism actually tends towards pluralism and not towards the use of one's soft and hard power, as Hillary Clinton said, to spread your values all over the globe. And you find many human rights activists, including Michael Ignatieff, the famous Michael Ignatieff, who supported the invasion of Iraq. And it was not a right-wing thing that happened with Iraq. There were plenty of liberal support for intervention and interventionisms of all kinds in the world today. So there's a stream of liberalism, which I think sees tolerance as a very important aspect of it. And that has to be grounded, it's true. It has to be grounded in some kind of characterization, either of the world as inherently plural, and hence honoring the truth of reality is to recognize diversity, or it has to be grounded in less of an ontological claim and more of an epistemological claim, which is some kind of claim about truth, about the limits of human reason to actually understand what the one truth is, which also would lead to a certain kind of tolerance that would come from a humility in recognizing the limitations of your own capacity to know what is the truth. It does seem to me that I have to commit to the truth of that Confucianist proposition I put forward, which is that the world is incomplete if seen from any one point of view, which is part of the license for a pluralism. And it also leads me to a stance which is against universalizing your own way of life. And to the extent that you have traditions which are trying to proselytize and to spread the good news everywhere and use their hard and soft power to do so, seems to me that's a point at which I become a critic. There's much more to be said, but I hope that's at least an outline of how I would try to answer the great question that Webb is raising.
That's great. Thanks a lot there, Rick. So we've got a question from Michael Lambeck. Michael, you ready to come in?
Unmuted. Thanks very much. These were great papers, and I was really relieved to see that the cognitivist bent didn't mean reductionism of any kind in any of these papers. So that was very nice. My comment is slightly along the lines of Webb's, I guess. I was struck in Rick's paper that his examples were often examples of rule following, and either you eat fish or you don't eat fish, or you divide your property one way or you divide your property another. But really the questions that I'm interested are more ones in exercise of judgment, where it is hard for the Hindu householder to decide between two different things which are actually incommensurably based values, and they have to struggle with which path to take. And that's where the ethics comes in, is not simply rule following, but kind of in a way in which there are exercising dilemmas. And I think Julia had a nice illustration of that. She had the dilemma of whether to take this guy to the hospital or not. And there was no, actually, I don't think there was a clear agreement on what the right answer was. You just, in the context of the situation, she had to make exercise her judgment, and she went one way. And happily, she didn't tell us this, but I guess the guy got better in the hospital rather than worse. So the outcome was a good one. It might have happened. It might not have happened that way. In fact, we didn't know what the outcome was going to be. So, and I think that, you know, Webb was pointing to a paradox about the pluralist position, which I don't think is resolvable in the absolute abstract way. I think we can only resolve it practically. That is, in one circumstance, we may take the pluralist position, and there may be another moment where we don't take the pluralist position. We take our own inherited position, or we acknowledge the position of the other for a certain period of time. But it's like the question is, the liberal position, well, freedom of speech, everybody can speak. What do you do about hate speech? Do we incorporate those people who want to include, do pluralists want to acknowledge non-pluralists in a sense? And what do we do with that? And I do think that is a paradox that cannot be resolved in an absolute sense, but must be resolved circumstantially. And that's why I take the kind of position I do to ethical life.
Thanks so much, Michael. So Rick, if you'd like to respond, but also I think if anybody else wants to come in, I think all of the other speakers, your co-hosts, so you could just unmute yourselves if you want to contribute anything.
Yeah, well, by the way, for just something I forgot in response to Webb, the case of the widow who eats fish was a hypothetical transgression probe among many that were part of an interview procedure. So I wasn't describing the frequency of which widows in that community eat fish, or an emerging opposition to the local understanding of what widowhood's about. But Julia, maybe you could help us a little bit before I say anything else. And first of all, telling us what was the outcome. And secondly, how did you experience the dilemma? I mean, were you really in a moral dilemma, or were you just faced with a conviction about what you should do and others who happen to disagree with you?
Well, so in terms of the outcome, I mean, it was a long process, but my friend Sen was in a series of hospitals, and he didn't walk for, I think, over a year, and he slowly started to get better, and now he's still alive, but he's still having some issues. I think he goes to the hospital pretty regularly, including the psychiatric hospital from alcoholism-induced psychosis, I think was what the doctor framed it as. So he's still struggling, but definitely I think it was a real moral dilemma for me. I really didn't know what to do at all. And I don't even know that people really disagreed with me. There wasn't like a fight. In fact, people, I think Sen's friends and family said, what should we do? You know, we don't know what to do. Let's figure it out together. But I could tell that there were kind of a friction of different morals at play. Even some of my friends, Sen's friends said, you know, here, you know, if things were a little bit different, even Rick, when you were talking about different patterns of household lives, when my friend Sen, you know, he didn't get married, he was gay and he didn't have a house to move to because male men in this community move usually to the households of their wife. And so there's all these patterns and histories and cultural kind of contingencies there that played into the issue. And people would tell me, you know, we need to figure out what to do together. And so I guess the decision that I made almost happened through my own work with other people, but also I think having been away, it kind of struck me as something immediate in a way that I don't think it had to the people that were there when we see the same things over time. But it's a long story, but basically I think maybe to address what you're saying, Michael, maybe I'm trying to point out that moment of the interactions there as the site of these kinds of the ethical projects or this relationality as a way a little bit to avoid the problems or the paradoxes that you're pointing out about the inability to really get past the sense that when we try to have an ethical, you know, a moral realist kind of stance, then can we be a pluralist and say, well, you know, this person who's making this definite moral stance is completely valid in its own way. I think what I'm trying to point out about the moments of these ethical dilemmas that get made through the kind of ordinary ethics or the practices allow us maybe in some ways to get away from making absolute statements, because as we know, and as Rick has pointed out many times, you know, that if we try to make these abstract kind of point to these abstract concepts, it's really difficult to look at real examples as moments of them, because every time we have a real example or real moments, there are different kinds of issues that come into play through those interactions. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I was trying to go with using that as an example. But Rick, you may have a different take on that.
Well, the one thing I wondered with your example was whether it really was you operating in an ethics of autonomy framework, or whether the conflict really turned on you assuming a paternalistic medicine framework, which is not really an ethics of autonomy. I mean, you were not respecting the autonomy of the patient. And someone who is pressing for an ethics of autonomy in medicine is certainly going to reject what was, in fact, the tradition of paternalistic medicine, in which you put your hands in the hands of someone who knew better than you did what was in your interest. And that's essentially what you were doing, combined with a very secular view of what's important in life, which was that you get better, and health ends up being sort of the sacred concept operating. But it did seem to me that you know, you ordered an ambulance, you forcibly brought this person out of his home. This is not the ethics of autonomy. In fact, it feels a little bit more like a certain version of the ethics of community, the kind of thing that happened in families where parents make judgments about what they're going to do to their children, whether the children like it or not. And I'm wondering if that occurred to you at all.
Yeah, really briefly, I think it did. And even as I was putting this together for today, I was thinking, gosh, you know, I don't think I would have made the same choices when I first had entered the field. It had been over a course of years where I started to think with the people that I was working with. And I think that's also super interesting to think about how we're starting to kind of get into the moral frameworks of the people we're working with as we're spending more time there. And so, yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, I don't know whether or not it's strictly an ethic of autonomy or community that I was working with, but I would definitely agree, Rick, that there was something about my own moral judgments and my own decisions that had to do with thinking with people and not necessarily against them in this kind of binary of two different frameworks. I was already incorporating some of these logics while I was making these decisions. Thank you for bringing that up.
With regard to Michael's comments, which I like a lot, I don't think that I'm sympathetic. I'm certainly not opposed to the idea of looking at conflicts that emerge within systems. I'm not sure I would say that what I was describing was rule following. I think that the widow's orientation to her diet is basically based on an understanding that the widow has of the category of hot foods versus cold foods, likely consequences of eating those foods as they view it, the relationship of what might happen if they ate those foods in relationship to what they view as a marriage that goes on even after death, and the consequences that might have for the feelings of their deceased husband and that person's spirit. That doesn't feel to me like rule following. It sounds to me like judgment based on beliefs of a certain kind and values of a certain kind put together to produce that judgment. There certainly are many cases in which certain kinds of commitments within the community might lead to conflicts that arise, which they themselves would find puzzling and difficult to resolve. I also do think that agree that the question of how should a liberal react to illiberal practices, it may well be that trying to give an abstract answer to that is not the best way to proceed, and that it'll perhaps always be settled in context, probably in relationship to power relationships, and the degree to which people are able to impose their will on others rather than having to settle for a live and let live outcome. Which is one of the wisdoms, it seems to me, in our own liberal tradition or constitutional tradition, the great importance of balance of power and division of sovereignty if you're going to have a multicultural society. And I think we have to be very attentive to that. You may remember, I don't know if you'll remember or not, but Lévi-Strauss, 25 years after the founding of the United Nations Declaration, was invited to come back to the United Nations and give a speech about racism in the world. And he made a very controversial statement, extremely provocative statement, but he basically said he thought the best one could do in the battle against racism was relative equality and sufficient physical distance from one another. That was Lévi-Strauss. But he was basically recognizing how hard tolerance is for the other, and that if you're going to have it, you're certainly going to need equal resources so that no group can impose itself on the other. And it may also be the case that separation is the way in which cultural preservation goes on. I mean, that's what the Amish do. That's what the Satmar Hasidim do. It's not a commitment to free affiliation. And it may well recognize that if you just had free affiliation under current power situations, you're going to lose your tradition. And I think that's a reality.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, Rick, what I enjoyed best in your comments were your responses to Demet when you mentioned three things, one of which was the non-Confucian one, and I would love to have those three statements of yours because they seem to be very close to what I think, but they were very well articulated, and I'm hoping you can share them. The other thing I want to say, though, is that in response to your discussion with Julia here, is maybe individual versus communal isn't kind of a binary opposition that we have to resolve every time in every case. Maybe this has nothing to do with that particular kind of division that you've set up as a kind of objectivist distinction. I don't see why it should be put as one or the other of those things. And I think from Julia's position, she was acting as an individual, but from the perspective of her subject, I forget his name, it was not that at all. So, I mean, she was advocating her individual rights or in relation to what ones that he then didn't have in that particular moment. So I think it's more complicated than that. I also think that when we talk about ethical life, we also talk about the failures. We have to talk about the failures we make and the ways in which things don't go right. And one response here might have been to just ignore things, to push it aside, which Julia didn't do, and which is the most interesting thing about this situation for me, that she felt she had to step in and do something and she couldn't look the other way.
Okay, if I can just come in there.
I had a quick question for Radu, but I don't want to insert it unless it's appropriate.
We have a question which Girish Jaswani's been waiting for a while. I think we're really out of time, so Girish, if you can make it a brief contribution, because we're going to have to wrap up in a few minutes.
All right, so I'll have the last word then. Fantastic. Can you hear me? Can you hear what I'm saying? Good. I guess I just want to say that I really enjoyed this panel. I didn't think I would really enjoy it this much, but I have enjoyed it much more than I than I thought, because I think partly it raised so many questions that I'm still thinking through and grappling with. And my point is, I think what a lot of these papers that you point to is the problem of the assumption of basically objectivity, and that somehow anthropologists are objective social scientists or scientists. And this is just completely, so most of these papers are actually pointing to the contradiction or the complexity of that assumption, that we are not really objective, and we never have been. And in these cases of these examples, not only are we also basically implicated in the lives of our kind of interlocutors, we are family and friends and we are part of them, but that we are living contradictions ourselves as anthropologists. And the contradictions that perhaps we should be looking at are these kind of like how basically a pluralism is what we all are. We have multiple coexisting, contradictory kind of basically opinions at the same time. But how are we actually at different moments in our lives bringing these and pulling these in together, or trying to separate? So this idea of somehow distance, this whole Judeo-Christian notion of somehow we are separate from God, and this whole idea that we are separate from the people that we are trying to study. This is a problem that I think some of these papers have helped us think through. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, would anyone else like to come in on that from the panel?
The only thing I would say is that if you give up on striving for objectivity, if you think the world is entirely subjective, then might makes right. Okay.
Okay. Sorry, Rick.
Yeah, did you want to stop now, or can I?
You could just have
I had one quick question for Radu to just clarify something he said.
Yeah, if you make it very quick. Yep, go ahead.
So Radu, what was it that your cousin who was irate felt would have been the fair solution? Because it strikes me that I'm a little bit suspicious that that was totally a non-reflective moment. It seems to me you can respond with anger, but there's an eliciting situation. And the eliciting situation was something you were aware of, he was aware of, namely he was being offered something he thought was unfair. And I would guess that he had a notion right then of what he thought was fair. And it wasn't simply intuitive in the sense of being something he didn't know or what was conceptually unavailable to him.
Yes, definitely. I think it was. I think it accessed quite rapidly a computation delivering a quick response that this is unfair. However, it was not the kind of slow process of reflecting of considering multiple variants and having some sort of a rational, so to speak, decision whether this was right or wrong. But I don't think I meant he didn't have. He only had access to the output. He didn't have access to the process of delivering that that idea, that feeling that he had.
What did he think would have been fair?
He should have gotten more because he was the skilled worker, and the other cousin just got the deal. So the other person brought that client, but he did most of the work. So anything.
But don't you think those reasons were available to him right there at the moment?
I don't think because it came impromptu. So he was presented with this immediately. It wasn't in the course of a discussion. The other one just said, "Okay, let's split it half-half." So it wasn't in the course of a discussion. Maybe if it was in a course of discussion, both of them maybe have brought arguments, and perhaps they would have reached a fair deal for both of them. Yeah. Do I have time for a very quick question for Rick as well?
Yes, you do, Radu. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So in that excellent example in India, if we would, can you speculate, or what the answer would have been if we have said, listen, so there is this fish, it comes from Australia, and it's not hot. It doesn't make women sexually active. Can the widow eat this fish?
I think if you convince them that it was a cool food, I think they would be able to eat it, yes.
Yeah, so you know, the problem is not what you eat. The problem is what makes you sexually active and in a way morally hazardous to the community, to other men, to other women, and so on.
Well, this is the point at which Michael's observation might be very appropriate, which is that, you know, habits build up, and perhaps they do get formulated as rules, and people are reluctant to give them up even in the face of contrary evidence. I suppose that's one of the things that the force of tradition has going for it.
But I actually have an example from my ethnography of precisely what Radu is saying, where people changed the taboo on chicken according to the circumstances and used their judgment to do that.
Yeah.
So
well, I mean, look, you know, in the community I'm in, people, you'll see them pulling their earlobes a lot when they feel desanctified. And, you know, they have figured out a way, and, you know, Judaism is very good at doing this too, Orthodox Jews. I mean, they can't bathe themselves at that moment when they feel desanctified in a holy stream of some kind. They certainly can't go to the Ganges. So they believe that there's liquid inside their earlobes that's pure, and they pull their earlobes to sanctify themselves. I mean, on the spot and in the context, they figure out creative ways of doing this, but they're honoring a principle when they're doing it.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap up now for today, guys. Thanks so much to everybody for your participation. I think this was actually a very, very interesting panel and some very kind of central issues really in anthropology, in the methodology of anthropology and the ethics of anthropology we discussed. And we're going to have more time to talk about them later in the plenary session, which I really look forward to. Just before we wrap up, Girish Jaswani just shared in the chat with everyone, I'm not saying that there is no claim to objectivity, but the objectivity concretizes at different times. And my question would be, whose might makes the objective right? So I think this is something that we can talk about more in the plenary, but thanks a lot to everyone. This has been a tough year, I think, for all of us, but for me at least, it's been really great to have this opportunity to talk with all of you and to talk about what are some very fascinating issues in anthropology. So I'll say goodbye to everyone now.
Thank you.